Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Nicole, and on today's episode, I'm answering a question from a listener. I get lots of questions each week, and this gives me a great way to provide answers that many of you might find helpful. If you have a question that you'd like me to consider answering on a future episode, just email it to support@drbeurkens.com, and you just might hear it on an upcoming show. Now, on to today's question. This question comes from Elizabeth, who writes, "My son, who is 7, is still bursting into tears, yelling, stomping, and throwing things when he makes a mistake or doesn't get his way. It's hard for him to self-regulate when he has reached his red zone." Well, Elizabeth, I can have a lot of empathy for you around this, and I think lots of other parents can too. This is a common issue that parents deal with, especially if you have a child who struggles with attention issues, anxiety issues, mood, behavior, learning kinds of challenges. This issue of being able to tolerate uncomfortable feelings and regulate your behavior appropriately, it's a tough one. And it's tough in general for 7-year-old kids. Kids at that developmental stage are still learning how to understand their big feelings that they have, how to handle things like frustration, disappointment, shame, all of those sort of intense, really uncomfortable feelings. And most kids at this stage of development are still needing support and continued practice around this. So hopefully that puts your mind at ease a little bit. And even if you're the parent of a much older child who's still struggling with this, that's okay. All of these things that I'm going to talk about are going to be helpful for you as well. So what are some of the big picture things to think about here? One of the first things that comes to my mind is the idea that all feelings are welcome, all behaviors are not. So this is getting at the idea that how your son is feeling is completely fine. If he's feeling embarrassed, if he's feeling hurt, frustrated, angry, worried, whatever it might be, those feelings are fine. But all behaviors are not fine, which means that you as the parent or the adult in the situation are going to put some firm limits on what behavior comes out of your child's feelings. So we'll talk about that more in a minute. One of the other big picture things that is coming up for me in this situation is the need to build tolerance for feeling uncomfortable feelings, and also skills for being able to calm yourself and to engage in problem solving, perhaps, depending on what the situation is. And this development of tolerance for uncomfortable feelings, we get better at it throughout our lives, hopefully, with practice. But that's a really important one because uncomfortable feelings are a part of life. So building this tolerance or raising our kids' threshold for being able to manage those uncomfortable feelings, also coupled with building skills for calming and for problem solving. So important to recognize that this isn't just going to happen without support and guidance. Kids absolutely do need our support, our teaching, our guidance, our modeling for this. They really need to be able to do this first with us before they do it on their own. So let's also think about the fact that kids who have very limited tolerance for distress, for making mistakes, for problems that come up, often have some underlying physiological things going on as well. Now, not 100% of the time, but I find that very often kids with really low frustration tolerance, kids who really, really struggle with managing any amount of uncomfortable feelings or distress, often what's going on is they don't have much room in their cup to handle increased stressors. And what I mean by that is their threshold is already pretty maxed out by other things, underlying things that are going on, including physiological things. So there isn't a lot of extra tolerance. They don't have a lot of extra space to sort of manage or work through these kinds of uncomfortable situations that come up. And I'll talk more about some specifics with that in a moment, but I think it's important to recognize that kids who have, like, let's say issues like chronic constipation or, chronic headaches, or maybe are having allergies or not absorbing nutrients from food well, so they have issues with that. Any of those kinds of underlying physical things reduce the brain and the body's threshold for managing other stuff. So I just think it's important to recognize that. Okay, so those are the big picture things. Now let's talk about some specific strategies. So in the moment, how is it helpful to respond? Well, a lot of the same things that I talk about when I answer lots of these kinds of questions, it's going to be important to stay calm. Your first job as the parent or the adult in the situation is, as the child's behavior and reaction and emotions are escalating, you want to work on de-escalating yourself, on keeping yourself more calm, more regulated, more in your thinking brain and focused on the situation and the task at hand, as opposed to letting your mind and feelings run away with the kid and the situation. So keeping ourselves regulated and staying calm is always going to be step number one in these situations. It's also going to be important to empathize with his feelings and what you think is going on. So that could sound like, oh, that didn't go how you wanted it to go, or you feel really frustrated that you made a mistake, or I think you might be really mad that I said you can't have more screen time. Those kinds of things. We are kind of tuning into what we think is really going on underneath this big reaction that they're having, and honing in on helping to bring their attention to what is probably really going on, the underlying feeling of that. So he might be, throwing the Lego thing that didn't come together, right? Or tearing up his paper or whatever. And what we want to do is, instead of focusing on that, we want to focus on what we think is going on underneath that. Oh, you're so frustrated that you just can't get that math problem right, or whatever it might be. So that's the empathy part. That's the acknowledging. That's the helping kids to recognize what's really going on and helping them to see that we get that. We understand that there's something going on, that they're having a big feeling, that they're uncomfortable. Okay, so that's the first part. The second part, though, is to set firm boundaries around behavior, around what they're actually doing. So, yelling is fine, and yelling you can't do anything about because you can't control what comes out of your child's mouth. As much as you might want to try to set limits and boundaries around that, you cannot control how loudly a child says things or what's coming out of their mouth. So that's not a boundary. Is not saying, you need to quiet down. You can't say those things. You need to stop yelling. That's not a boundary because you don't have any control over it. The boundary would be, if you're going to yell, I'm going to take you in the other room, or, you setting a boundary around what you can control. A boundary would be, you don't respond to him when he's yelling. You stay really calm and really quiet and don't try to speak over him or get into a yelling match. So the boundary with things like yelling is what you can control, not trying to control what is coming out of the child's mouth. Some other real appropriate boundaries in a situation like this could be moving him to a different area, maybe a quieter, less stimulating area, maybe an area where siblings aren't, especially if he has a tendency to maybe get physically aggressive or start saying awful things to the sibling or drag the sibling into it. Or if you have another child who's easily distressed, a good boundary would be, I can see that you're feeling really angry about this because I said no. I'm going to help you go to the other room so that we can work through this. And with little kids, you can pick them up and move them. If needed. With a 7-year-old, you may need to do a firm taking by the hand or sort of physically guiding. If a child is extremely aggressive, physically resistive, or this is an older, much bigger child who is refusing to go to another space, you don't want to get in a power struggle with that. You would then clear the general area, create some physical boundaries where you are, send other people to another space in the house or whatever, and you try to create an environment right there where you can better manage the situation. But in the case of a 7-year-old, typically saying, I'm going to help you go to the other room where we can, work through this. Certainly another boundary that you can set and can control is removing items that could be damaged. So if there's an item in the general area that you're worried is going to get damaged, or, that he's going to be aggressive towards, moving that. So in general, setting these limits and enforcing these boundaries around what you can control in the environment to not allow this to continue to escalate, not allow him to get out of control and break things or harm people, those types of things. Now, once you have that established, staying with him, if that's helpful, that can be a great approach here for a lot of kids that works well. Maybe you bring them to their bedroom or to another space and you stay in there, maybe just, staying, sitting against the door, staying very quiet, very calm, letting him continue to work through his dysregulation and upset. If he's becoming aggressive towards you, again, setting firm boundaries around that. I won't let you hurt me. And that means, holding on to his hands if needed, maybe even, doing a firm hug with him facing away so that he's not able to kick or bite or those kinds of things. There are ways to create physical boundaries there if needed. Another option for some kids, it's best to give them a little bit of space to work through it. So you may wait on the other side of the door and say, I'll be right here. I'm going to give you some space if that's what is more helpful to your child, and let them work through it and be right there and, come in and out and check on them, or when they're calm and able to handle somebody else's presence again and feel okay about that, then you can go in. So you need to kind of know your child best in terms of what's helpful. And sometimes you can try both ways, and see. But again, the general idea here is, it's okay to feel angry, and I'm not going to allow you to break things or hurt me or, whatever it might be. So this idea of empathy with firm limits and boundaries. Now, our tendency as parents or adults, teachers, therapists, whatever, is to, once the child calms, immediately launch into talking about, what lesson they should take from it or what they should do differently or trying to rehash it. That can work sometimes with kids, but in general, it is not helpful to launch right back into it and rehash it and try to teach lessons immediately after they've calmed. Their nervous system is still in a really vulnerable place. They maybe have just sort of been able to get those big feelings and those physical reactions down to a level that feels more manageable, where they're a bit more regulated, but they are vulnerable. And so if we launch into it right away, for a lot of kids, that has the tendency to throw them right back into a dysregulated, overreactive cycle. So I prefer to, once the child has calmed and they've worked through it and we've helped them, settle, we just move on. We don't make a big deal out of it. We don't harp on it. We don't try to talk about it at that time. We just move on with whatever is next. If there's restitution that needs to be made, fine. Say, I'm going to help you pick up all these pencils that you threw, or we're going to, take these papers and throw them in the trash or whatever. But otherwise, you just move on and do not try to rehash the situation in that moment. Later on, when your child has been in a nice, calm, regulated space for a good amount of time, maybe it's later that day, maybe it's even the next day, you can then, when you're feeling regulated and ready to address it, and you feel like your child is too, if needed, you can review the situation with them. Now, it is not always needed. We do not have to turn every single one of these situations and incidents with our kids into some sort of teaching, lesson, rehashing situation. We really don't. But if you feel like there's something there that needs to be revisited or something that you want to discuss, that would be the time to do it well after. Talk about what happened, what you noticed, see if they have any ideas about what was really going on for them, and then, maybe review some different ways to problem solve that, or even, asking them, what would be helpful for me to do in those situations for you, or how could we do that differently next time? Okay, so that's how you handle those situations in the moment. Now, there are also longer term strategies that I think are really beneficial for kids who struggle with this. Again, recognizing that all kids, especially at this developmental stage, we're talking about a 7-year-old right now, struggle with this at times. But if you notice that this is a chronic issue for your kid, this isn't just a once in a while thing when they're overtired or whatever, this is a chronic problem that comes up, or you have an older child who's still really struggling with this, there are some bigger picture, longer term strategies that can be helpful. One that I like is preview and review. So if you know that your child has a tendency to get really frustrated in certain situations, or maybe to not handle disappointment well, or that there's a likelihood that a certain situation may bring up some of this kind of, these big feelings and then these, behavioral kinds of challenges as a result, preview it ahead of time. Talk before going into it about, let's think about this. How do we want to handle this? What's worked before? What can we anticipate? What might you feel? Just even previewing kids' feelings can help inoculate them against it, can help make them less thrown off by it in the moment. Let's think about the last time you went over to Joey's house, this happened and you felt, so hurt by that, or you felt so embarrassed by that. What if that happens again? Like, let's think about that. What if this thing happens? How will you feel? What might come up for you? What are some ways you can respond? This is an opportunity to preview some of the strategies, coping strategies that may be helpful, things like taking a break, taking deep breaths, whatever. So you're previewing the situation. And then you're going through, if the situation actually happens, then after the fact, you can review and say, okay, what worked? What didn't? How did you handle this? What came up for you? What could we do differently next time? So for these chronic situations, which are likely to elicit these big reactions in your child, preview and review. Pre-thinking about it beforehand and then thinking about it afterwards to sort of solidify things that went well and talk about what you could do differently next time. That's a great strategy that works in so many situations with our kids. I think also it can be helpful to practice making mistakes intentionally. Elizabeth said that one of the things that's a big trigger for her child that she's asking this question around is that when he makes mistakes, when something doesn't go, perfectly, he gets instantly really, really distressed and dysregulated. So a great longer term strategy is to practice making mistakes intentionally. Come up with, all the ways we can miss when we're throwing the basketball into the hoop, or let's, we're going to write this word out and we are going to make 5 mistakes as we write it, or whatever it might be. Now that may sound kind of silly, but what it does is it helps inoculate kids against these big feelings around making mistakes. It helps normalize it. When we make it intentional, it's a safer way for them to practice with mistakes and feel okay about it. But it's a good entry point to taking the power, the emotional power out of making mistakes or expecting perfection. So finding all kinds of fun ways to practice making mistakes, spotlighting your own mistakes when they come up, talking around the dinner table, I made this mistake at work today. Here's what happened. And here's how I felt. And here's how I dealt with it. Even with young kids, we can do that in a really, age appropriate kind of way. If they're in the kitchen with us and maybe we're working on making lunch and we spill something, we say, I messed up. I spilled that. Shoot, that's so frustrating. Let me get some paper towel and clean it up. Mistakes happen, that type of thing. Just spotlighting. Again, not intentionally teaching anything, but just sharing what's going on in your mind, your thoughts and your feelings when mistakes come up, just putting those out there for your child to be aware of. Then it can also be really helpful to teach some calming and regulatory strategies. And this can range from everything like teaching some breathing techniques or like using a squeeze ball or some other physical stress reliever to using some mindfulness activities and tools or doing some yoga together. Anything that promotes building the brain connections that allow for more space between having a feeling and responding to it. So many options there. There's all kinds of books and activities and techniques and so many great things out there to use with kids now. And it's more than we can, get into in answering this question, but I think this is a longer term important strategy for kids who have chronic issues with regulating their behavior around big, uncomfortable feelings. They need to be taught some strategies for self-soothing, for helping themselves to get their nervous system back in a more regulated state. So that can be lots of different things, but important to practice and important to make those part of, daily and weekly routine so that they're practicing working with those when they're not really distressed, because they need a lot of practice on it when they're feeling okay and feeling settled and regulated before they will be able to use those tools like deep breathing, like mindfulness, like grabbing a squeeze ball or thinking to do, some jumping jacks or a physical activity in the moment. They need practice outside of intensely emotional, dysregulated moments in order to be able to eventually use those tools in the heat of the moment. So hopefully that makes sense. Some other big picture things to consider real quick, just in terms of the physiological things that could be going on, things that lower a child's threshold for being able to cope with, uncomfortable feelings, disappointments, anger, those types of things. Sleep is a big one to look at. Kids who are not getting enough good quality sleep often have very low coping thresholds for this stuff and are much more reactive in these kinds of situations. So I'd want to be looking at, if this is a chronic kind of issue that I'm dealing with my child, are they getting enough sleep? Are there some things we need to work on there? I'd also be looking at things related to the diet. Is their blood sugar stabilized? Are these incidents happening on a regular basis because their blood sugar is crashing, because they're on a blood sugar roller coaster of lots of simple carbs and sugars, and then crashing quickly and being really moody and irritable and, not having, a threshold high enough to be able to deal with this? Are they getting a nutrient dense diet? Are they dehydrated? Are they just not, drinking enough water? Are they having sensitivities or allergies or reactions to foods that they're eating? That can lead to really a lot of this sort of irritable, low threshold, low ability to handle frustrations or uncomfortable feelings. Looking at the overall stress level, what's going on for the child in their life? Have there been a lot of family stressors, school stressors, peer stressors? Those kinds of things, again, they fill a kid's cup really quickly and leave very little space then for them to handle these kinds of things that come up in life. Are they getting enough movement? Movement is such a regulating thing for kids. So are they being too sedentary? Are they getting enough physical movement? And then again, as I alluded to at the start of my response to this question, making sure that you're looking at physical issues, things like constipation, digestive discomfort, headaches, pain, allergies, anything that might be lowering his overall threshold to tolerate things in the moment. And it's important to recognize that all of those physiological things absolutely have a direct impact on a child's ability emotionally and behaviorally to stay regulated and handle things. All you need to do is think about the last time you weren't feeling well. Maybe, if you've had issues ever with constipation, or if you've not had, enough sleep for a period of time, or maybe you've had a headache or just, had a cold or weren't feeling well, whatever it might be, think about your experience of that. And automatically, oh yeah, my threshold for tolerating much of anything was much lower, right? My threshold for being able to keep myself regulated and manage, challenges, problems, discomforts, things that came up much lower, right? So that's the premise behind recognizing the role that these chronic physiological kinds of things play and making sure that we're addressing those for kids. All right, so we covered a lot of ground with that, some big picture things to be thinking about, some specific strategies in the moment, and then some longer term strategies and ideas of how to address this for kids who chronically struggle with handling big feelings in more regulated ways. So I hope that this is helpful for Elizabeth and for any of you who are dealing with intense behavior when your child feels frustrated or makes a mistake. Remember, if you have a question you'd like to have answered on a future show, email it to support@drbeurkens.com. Please put podcast question in the subject line. That'll help my team sort through that. Thank you, as always, for being here and for listening, and I'll catch you back here next time.